Impulse. It's awesome to be able to share with you guys again over the weekend, and I hope you guys are doing well. And I hope you've been finding different activities to stay active and engaged throughout this crazy season. And I was thinking about different hobbies that I have picked up over the years. And while I haven't done it this season, about once a year, I always get into this puzzle craze. I love doing puzzles, and it usually is in the winter when I'm cooped up inside and I set up a card table and I put in some of my favorite Christmas movies and I just do puzzles. And it's a lot of fun. I'm one of those weird people that doesn't mind repeating puzzles either. And so year after year, I've kind of developed my favorites. But no matter how many times I've done a puzzle, the initial setup always seems kind of overwhelming, right? You put out all of these pieces and you see them scattered about, and you start to think, how is this going to come together? What is the final picture really going to look like? And even though you have a box that shows you what it is, when you just look at the individual pieces, it can feel kind of overwhelming. But over time, as you start to put together things, I always start with a border, I start to see the framework. And then as I start to put together bigger pieces and I put them in the puzzle, it all starts to come together. And eventually, I'm able to see the big picture. And that's what our whole series is about this year, right? Pastor Brad was here last week and he was sharing about this new series called The Big Picture, where we take the life of Joseph, found in the book of Genesis, and we see different ways that throughout his life there was a big picture, there was a plan, and yet in the moment, Joseph didn't always see that. And that's true of our own lives, right? We experience highs and lows throughout our lives, and sometimes we have a hard time seeing how different experiences really fit into the big picture or what God has in store for us. And yet we can know and trust and believe that there is a big picture. In the case of Joseph's life, last week Brad shared that he had a lot of brothers, and he was the youngest of those brothers, and he was also Dad's favorite. And so Joseph received a lot of perks and things that his other brothers didn't. And you can imagine that this didn't go over very well with them. So much so that they became jealous of their younger brother, and eventually they plot to kill him. Now, I don't know about you, I've got 3 siblings, and there were certainly moments growing up where I got really mad at one of them, or all of them, and yet I would never have thought to follow through with something as crazy as trying to kill my sibling. And yet we're going to pick up here in Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 19, and that's exactly the position that the brothers are in. See, they see their brother Joseph coming towards them. They've been working in the fields, and they see him coming from a distance, and we get this really interesting conversation taking place. So you can follow along. Again, that's Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 19. And it says, "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." And so they are so upset, they're so frustrated with Joseph, and he probably did some things to rub them the wrong way. And so they decide, hey, let's figure out a way to get rid of him. Now, a cistern, if you aren't familiar with that term, was basically a giant water tank. And so what would happen is the people lived, in a fairly dry area. So they would carve out these large, essentially kind of wells where they would store water. And so they could come to these places and get water when they needed it. And so these were often deep and damp because they stored water, and cold. And so Joseph, that's their plan. They're like, we'll throw him into one of those, and eventually an animal or something will happen to him, and then we'll be free from him. So in verse 21, then, we see this. "When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father." Now here you're thinking, oh, good. At least one brother is on Joseph's side, right? Like somebody has some common sense. But what's interesting is that Reuben was the one who said this, because Reuben was the oldest of all the sons. And in my family, anytime there was a disagreement or an issue between siblings, it always seemed like my older siblings tend to get the worst of the punishment because they should have known better, was what my parents would say. And so here's Reuben thinking, like, if something goes down, if my youngest brother, my dad's favorite, doesn't come out of this alive, it's going to fall on my shoulders. And so in some ways, Reuben's actions were kind of like self-preservation, like, hey, this will not go well for me if this happens. So then in verse 23, it says, "So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood.' His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt." So here's Joseph thinking, okay, I just escaped death. I'm stuck in a cistern. What more could go wrong in this situation? And then his brothers sell him into slavery. I mean, Joseph, it seems like, has the worst luck in the entire world, that so many terrible things kept happening to him. And if I was Joseph, I certainly would be afraid. I'd be terrified, like I'm gonna be a slave in some foreign land. I'd be so hurt and feel betrayed that my brothers did this to me, people that were supposed to have my back. Joseph must have been feeling so many emotions, and I'm sure there was confusion too. You know, God had given him these dreams, had told him of what his future was gonna be, and yet this seemed so far from what God had told him. Joseph couldn't see the bigger picture. And that's where sometimes we find ourselves. Sometimes it's hard to see the big picture in our lives. When I was in 8th grade, I decided to work up the courage and I ran for vice president of my class. And I had a whole slogan and I made buttons and I was all pumped up about this election. And I really felt like I had a good shot at winning it. And so election day came and my friends were all supporting me and I was super excited. And the next day they announced the results and I lost. And it was disappointing. And to be honest, kind of embarrassing, you know? I felt like, man, people don't like me, you know, what's going on? I thought this was a good idea. I thought I had, you know, the right skills to make this work. And it was really hard in those days right after the election to kind of hold my head up and see what could come out of this situation. Now, thankfully, there was something good that came out of it. See, if I had won, I wouldn't have been able to join a different club that I got involved in, one that I met some of my very best friends that I still have to this day. And so even though it was a really hard moment in my life, it ended up leading into something really awesome. And that's what Joseph's life actually is. There were a lot of really hard moments in his life, like being sold into slavery. And yet God was able to use those hard moments and make something really awesome out of them. If we continue Joseph's story in chapter 39 and verse 2, it says at the beginning, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered." So even though Joseph was experiencing all these crazy events in his life, the Lord was with Joseph. And I think that's the important thing for us to walk away with as we read throughout his life. Even when we can't see the big picture, even when Joseph couldn't see the big picture, God was with him. And God is with us. One of my favorite verses and one that I often turn to in times when I'm feeling confused or lost or unsure of myself is Joshua 1:9. And in it, God is speaking to Joshua and he tells him, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And what an incredible promise that God has made, that when we are his children, we've accepted that amazing bond between us and God, that he is with us, that he is with us wherever we go. He's with us in the highest of highs and in the lowest of lows. So I just want to share 2 quick thoughts that we can learn from Joseph's story about how God is with us. First is we've got to believe it. It's interesting that in Joseph's story, we never get a verse that says Joseph complained or yelled or was angry or fought with God. And in fact, it doesn't say anything about that. And so Joseph had to have this trust. He had to have something to hold on to carry him through these hard moments. And I believe that he did have faith that God was with him. And so every time he found himself in a new crazy situation, he still prospered because God was with him. So how can you do that and be reminded of that truth on a regular basis, that God is with you? Maybe you need to start your day by just saying it out loud. You look at a mirror and you're like, God is with me. Maybe you're someone that needs to write it down and put it somewhere that you'll see it frequently. Whatever you have to do to remind yourself that God is with you. Let that be enough to get you through just one day, and then say it again the next day and the next day. God is with you. The second thing I'd encourage you to do is to look for God's presence in your life. God has his fingerprints all over our lives, sometimes in more obvious ways than others, but he's always present. And so it's really important for us to be on the lookout for it. How has God been present in your life? How have you seen him work in your life? And it's easy then when we can draw on past experiences and say, God was totally with me there. I know he's going to be with me here too. And so be on the lookout. Find those opportunities where God is moving and see them for what they are. God shows himself to us in so many different ways. Maybe it's through music, the right song came on the radio. Maybe it's through nature, you were on a walk and you just really felt God's presence, or scripture, or encouragement from a friend, or a warm hug from a family member. God's presence is all around us. He is with us. And that's the big picture that we can hold on to. Even when the smaller pieces seem completely random and there's no way it's going to come together, God is with you.